Hello and welcome back. This is Season 8 of the Everyday Christian Podcast. I hope that you have enjoyed the previous seasons, and I am very excited to get started with this brand new season. I am particularly excited because we're going to be covering probably my favorite book in the entire Bible this season, and that is the book of Ecclesiastes. The theme for this season is fear God and keep His commandments. That's Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. That's the theme of this book, and I am just really looking forward to studying this material. I appreciate you for tuning in to previous seasons. This season will be just me. I don't plan on having any co-host. If that changes, of course, you'll know, but I'm planning on just going through this entire season solo, and I've got all the episodes lined out, so I'm really looking forward to this. But we want to start today with an introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. What is the meaning of life? Were you to ask this to 1,000 different people, you might get 1,000 different responses, right? Some responses we could immediately toss out as obviously incorrect. If someone says, live and let live, just live it up. Well, no, that is not the meaning of life. Eat, drink, and be merry, some might say, and that as well is not the meaning of life. But what about the saying, carpe diem? Perhaps you've heard that. I think that is Latin, and it means seize the day. You might have to think about that one a little more, right? A Roman poet by the name of Horace, he uttered those words in the time shortly before Christ, and here's what he wrote about that. He said, life is short. Should hope be more? In the moment of our talking, envious time has ebbed away. Seize the present, or seize the day, carpe diem. Trust tomorrow even as little as you may. So that was an interesting thing that Horace wrote. I think he's right to an extent. Carpe diem, we certainly need to seize the day. That is, we need to live in the present. But trust tomorrow even as little as you may. That's a little interesting. We need to understand as Christians that we can trust our tomorrow. We do have hope for tomorrow. And we should be living for today and tomorrow when you think about it. Now, don't live in the past. We know that. Don't dwell on our past mistakes and things like that. As long as those things have been forgiven, the Bible teaches that our past sins have been tossed into the depths of the sea to be remembered no more. If we are faithful Christians and have truly been forgiven of those things. So we don't need to live in the past, but we certainly do need to live in the present, and we need to live for the future. So I think about Horace's thoughts there, and I think a lot of people take this view of carpe diem, seize the day or live for the day. I think that they take the mindset of who cares about tomorrow. That's a very worldly philosophy to live by. Sometimes there was an expression probably 10 or 15 years ago now that was really popular when I was in my late teens and going into my early 20s. This expression was very popular, and that was YOLO. You only live once. And the idea was, well, you only live once, so have as much fun as you can. Now, it is true that we only live once, but that doesn't mean that we should be living our lives solely for fun. There's nothing wrong with having some fun, but that should not be our sole purpose in life. I wonder if Horace was well read in the writings of Solomon. I wonder if he had read the Old Testament scriptures that were written during the time that he was alive. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that I have read that Horace was a type of hedonist. Are you familiar with that term, hedonism? Hedonism is basically living for as much pleasure as humanly possible. Do whatever you want in the here and now because human pleasure is the ultimate pursuit in life. That is what a hedonist believes. It's a type of materialism because it neglects the fact that there is something more to our existence than just the physical things that we can observe with our senses. It neglects the fact that we are spiritual beings that will answer to God, who is above what we see. So that gets us into the realm of theology, the supernatural, not just the natural world around us, but the supernatural. God exists, and he created this physical world. So we think about that, and our Christianity is in stark contrast to materialism and hedonism. So Horace was a hedonist. Specifically, he was an Epicurean. Now, Acts 17, verse 18 actually speaks about the Epicureans. I'm going to read just a few verses there. Acts 17, and we're going to begin reading Acts 17, beginning in verse number 16. It says, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols." The city of Athens was just totally given over to idolatry. Therefore, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who had happened to be there. Verse 18, Acts chapter 17. "Then certain Epicureans," so there's that word, Epicurean, and also Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" So you get the idea that they had no interest in what Paul was going to teach. Some said that. Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." Well, of course, Paul ends up preaching that marvelous sermon to the unknown God. You see that in verse number 23, and that's one of my favorite sermons in all of Scripture, because Paul uses that as an object lesson. They actually had an altar to the unknown God there, and Paul says, "Look, the unknown God that you ignorantly worship, let me tell you who he is." And I'm paraphrasing that, of course. So the Epicureans, of which Horace was one of them, they were a milder form of hedonism compared to some of the other forms of hedonism, but their basic philosophy was still only concerned with living the smoothest, most pleasurable life possible. It was also an atheistic philosophy as well. So back to Solomon, and we can go to 1 Kings. You can read about Solomon in 1 Kings, and we're going to go to chapter 4, beginning in verse number 29. 1 Kings 4, beginning in verse number 29, it says, "And God gave Solomon wisdom, and exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east, and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Chalcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish." Basically, Solomon's a biologist, which is interesting. Essentially, both plants and animals he studied. Verse 34, "And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon." So Solomon was the wisest man on earth at the time, and the only one who ever surpassed his wisdom would have been Jesus Christ. But guess what? Solomon still fell into the trap of the same kind of sinful mindset that we all tend to find ourselves falling into from time to time. Solomon was given extraordinary wisdom from God, but then he was influenced, as we read later, by 700 wives and 300 concubines. 700 wives and 300 concubines. They led him astray. They led him into idolatry and all kinds of sinful pursuits that ends up drawing Solomon away from God. Now, isn't that interesting? Because Solomon was wise, the wisest man on earth at the time, and he was led away into idolatry and other sins. Let's give an overview of this book of Ecclesiastes. The word Ecclesiastes means the person who gathers the congregation, or we might say the preacher. And it's in reference to Solomon, the preacher, and his words of wisdom to the congregation of God's people. So, in a sense, the book of Ecclesiastes is like a sermon. The theme of the sermon can be shown by the words, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." That's chapter 1, verse 2, and that thought is repeated several times in the book. Solomon goes on to ask, what is the point of everything done under the sun? And that phrase, under the sun, comes up several times in this book as well. Solomon is basically saying there's nothing new under the sun, and another way of saying that would be some things never change. We read Ecclesiastes, and we're going to see a lot of similar mindsets that are still going on today. In chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, Solomon says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. So Solomon set his heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. You get the impression that Solomon is a philosopher. He's a lover of learning and wisdom and things like that. And he's contemplative. He is a thinker. You see those old statues of the thinking man with the man kind of hunched over with his fist underneath his chin, right? And a thinking man. Well, I get that mindset that Solomon must have had. He was just constantly thinking and wondering about new things. And I relate to Solomon because I tend to think a lot. Sometimes I have a hard time letting my mind rest because I think in deep contemplative thought so much. So I can really relate to this, and that's probably one of the reasons why Ecclesiastes is probably my favorite book in the Bible. Now, I do say this as a caveat there. A lot of times I will tell people, what's your favorite book in the Bible? Whichever one I'm reading at the moment. So I say that a lot as well. But if I really had to pick one, I'd probably pick the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's further set up this book by going to 1 Kings again. And I want to go to 1 Kings 3, verses 7 through 14. 1 Kings 3, verses 7 through 14 says, Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. So this is Solomon's request for wisdom to God. Verse 8, And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. If you remember, God gave him options. He said, would you rather have riches or would you rather have wisdom? And so Solomon carefully thinks about that, I'm sure, and he prays for wisdom. So the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And you can keep reading there, but I want to go now to verse number 20, 1 Kings 4, verse 20, and we will read on down. But 1 Kings chapter 4, not chapter 3, but chapter 4, verses 20 to the end of the chapter. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. By the way, if you do a study of those verses, look up some commentaries and whatnot, you'll see that this was a tremendous fair, basically, I guess, a nightly banquet worth of all these different animals that were brought in for food. And certainly, this would not have been typical. This is a much more lavish feast every single day that Solomon was able to afford compared to others who were comparable to him. Verse 24, for he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river from Tipsah even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on every side all around him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for King Solomon, and for all who came to King Solomon's table, there was no lack in their supply. They also brought barley and straw to the proper place for the horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east, and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman the Chalcol, and Darda the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. And this is where we read earlier. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, birds, creeping things, and fish. And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. This is truly a remarkable character in our Bibles. And Solomon, this same Solomon, is the one who writes Ecclesiastes. So I want you to think about this. If anybody on earth was able to be qualified to write what we're about to read in this study, it was Solomon, right? And of course, Jesus Christ as well. But I'm thinking of Solomon here and his ability to speak to the subjects that we're going to talk about in this book, how he was searching for the meaning of life, and he had it all. He had everything his heart desired, and nothing would bring him happiness. Until we get to the very end of the book, we're going to find this is what he finally figured out, and that's Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13 and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all, or this is the whole duty of man. And then he says in verse 14 that every work of our lives will be brought into judgment one day. Let's read Psalm 72. Psalm 72, and we are going to read verses 1 through 5. And this is a psalm of Solomon, as the note with this psalm tells us. Psalm 72, verses 1 through 5. Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. He will judge your people with righteousness, and your poor with justice. The mountains will bring peace to the people, and the little hills by righteousness. He will bring justice to the poor of the people. He will save the children of the needy, and will break in pieces the oppressor. They shall fear you, as long as the sun and moon endure, throughout all generations. And you can keep reading that psalm, but the idea is that Solomon took his job very seriously. He asked for the ability to discern right from wrong and to make good judgments as a leader, and that is what he embarked to do as a leader of God's people. Now, one of the things that we're going to notice in this study is that Solomon actually gets depressed for a while, essentially, because he sees a lot of people around him that are not just in their judgments and are abusing people, abusing justice, perverting justice, and that gets him down. So we'll get to that in a few weeks. But finally, I want to go to 1 Kings chapter 11. As we're continuing to introduce the book of Ecclesiastes, we're giving some historical background. The Bible is its own best commentary. And so 1 Kings chapter 11, we are going to see, in spite of everything that we've read about Solomon so far, Solomon was going to fall into apostasy. He was going to backslide. He was going to be unfaithful. 1 Kings 11, beginning in verse number 1, says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, 'You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods.' Solomon clung to these women in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." Incidentally, there's something to be said there, young people. If you have not married yet, make sure that you marry right. Make sure that you marry a faithful Christian that's going to help you get to heaven, because if you don't, it's very, very likely that they will turn away your heart. "For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place. A high place. This is the same Solomon that built the temple of the Lord, and here he is, years later, building a high place of idolatry for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon." So this is probably, I would venture to guess, within sight of the temple of the Lord, just another hill over from the hill of Zion. We've got high places, altars built for these false gods. Isn't that terrible what Solomon did? But again, his foreign wives led him into this idolatry. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Young people, you better listen up to this, because this is tremendously important. You better marry a faithful Christian. How could a king so richly blessed by God, both in physical riches and power as well as wisdom, allow himself to fall? The answer is that although Solomon was wise, in fact, he was the wisest that there was, he wasn't always prudent. I want you to think about this, and when you study Proverbs, which Solomon also wrote, he emphasizes this. There is a difference between knowledge and wisdom and prudence. Knowledge is knowing things, and knowledge is extremely important. The fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, Proverbs teaches us. But then further from knowledge, you have wisdom. Wisdom is not only knowing things, but knowing how to apply that knowledge to make the right choice. Prudence takes things a step further than that, though, in that prudence not only knows how to make proper application, to make wise choices, but prudence takes the next step and goes ahead and actually does that thing. It goes ahead and actually makes the right choice. Solomon was the wisest man there was, but he was not always prudent. In fact, for a large portion of his life, he was very imprudent. He was not prudent. He made terrible decisions of idolatry and womanizing, essentially, and drunkenness, it appears, and many, many different things that he did that were not pleasing to God. So when we think about Solomon and his life, and we study this book of Ecclesiastes, we're going to see that Solomon's sins brought him low for a very, very large portion of his life. Now, this is my opinion that is, I believe, strongly supported by the evidence of the book of Ecclesiastes, especially chapter 12. I believe that Ecclesiastes is Solomon's repentance letter, or repentance sermon, we might say. I think that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes very close to the end of his life, and he did so to warn others not to make the same mistakes that he made, essentially searching for happiness in all the wrong places and squandering his life. Solomon could have been the most amazing man possibly to live outside of Jesus Christ, of course. But Solomon would have been right there at the top of the list of most amazing Bible characters, right there with his father David, right there with men like Elijah and Noah and New Testament, Paul and Peter, etc. Solomon was going to be near the top, but he squandered much of his life because he was living for the wrong things. I love Ecclesiastes because it helps us maintain proper priorities in our lives. The moral of the story of Ecclesiastes, again, verses 12 and 13 of chapter 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. If you want some resources to help you in this study of Ecclesiastes, I would recommend, as always, the book Know Your Bible by Brother Frank Dunn. He has good synopses of the various books of the Bible in that book. That's Know Your Bible by Frank Dunn. And then also I looked at the 1994 Memphis School of Preaching lectureship book on Ecclesiastes as well. And that book really breaks down the book into manageable sections. Much of that we will be using for this study. If you want to go ahead and organize some study notes, this is my tentative plan. I'll go ahead and tell you what the tentative plan is for each episode. Episode 1, this was the introduction to Ecclesiastes. Episode 2, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, the failure of science to bring true happiness. Episode 3, Ecclesiastes 1, verses 12 through 18, the failure of philosophy. Episode 4, Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 through 11, the failure of sensuous pleasures. Episode 5, chapter 2, verses 12 through 26, the failure of materialism. Episode 6, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, the providence of God. Episode 7, chapter 3, verses 16 to chapter 4, verse 3, the failure of human justice. Episode 8, chapter 4, verses 4 through 16, the failure of living for self. Episode 9, chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, the failure of false religion. Episode 10, chapter 5, verses 10 through 20, the failure of wealth. Episode 11, chapter 6, verses 1 through 12, the vanity of life. Episode 12, Ecclesiastes 7, verses 1 through 12, the value of practical wisdom, part 1. Episode 13, that's chapter 7, verses 13 through 29, the value of practical wisdom, part 2. And then episode 14, chapter 8, verses 1 through 10, the wisdom leads to obedience. Episode 15, chapter 8, verses 11 through 17, the reality of death. Episode 16, chapter 9, verses 1 through 18, true wisdom and surmounting life's problems. Episode 17, Ecclesiastes 10, verses 1 through 20, the folly of violating true wisdom. Episode 18, Ecclesiastes 11, verses 1 through 10, sowing unto righteousness. And then we get into chapter 12, beginning in episode 19. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, man goes to his everlasting home. Episode 20, Ecclesiastes 12, verses 9 through 14, the whole duty of man. And then episode 21, our season finale, final episode of this season will be a recap of what we have discussed in this book. So I am greatly looking forward to this study. I hope that you will join me next week as we continue our study of the wonderful book of Ecclesiastes.